Good evening, everybody. So today's the last lecture, and this lecture is about art. Yeah, no, it's exciting for you, isn't it? It's exciting for me too. Art and sustainability. So, as some of you know, most of you probably don't know, the research center that I direct has in it an art studio. And often one of the reactions I get when I tell people that we have an art studio is, why? Why do you have an art studio? What's the point of that? And there's a lot of people who have a hard time understanding the relationship between art and the more science-oriented work that we do research on. And they have a hard time with this, and it creates a sort of cognitive dissonance in them, and so it's uncomfortable for them. It's sort of a departure from disciplinary purity and so on. And so many people simply don't understand why we do this. And I think that's a reflection of a deeper problem here, and that problem is that you know, all too often a lot of our educational systems are giving you a great education for the problems of the last century. But we're not living in the last century, we're living in this century. And if you want to deal with the problems in this century, you need to acquire the knowledge and the skills and the tools appropriate to the challenges of today. And I think that one of the ways, and these include biology, you should understand biology, and you should understand information technology, you should take courses in engineering and ethics, but also in art. Art historically has been probably the single most important way that we look anew at familiar things. It forces us, artists are able to get us to look at things, and what we want to do today, what sustainability wants us to do, is to challenge the way the routines and the practices and the institutions that have become so familiar to us. It wants to shake us up and say, let's look at this a little bit differently. And art is also the way in which we engage and come to terms with things that are not familiar. So art plays an important role. And we're going to talk about that for the next little while. And I want to start off, I don't know how many of, I want to start off with an overview, and that there's a piece of earth art by the well-known painter Goleta. And I'll let you look at the overview for a second. And the first thing I want to do is give you a couple of minutes of this attempt, because in this attempt to simplify the challenges of sustainability, the graphic artists do a pretty good job. So let's take a quick look at this. Get it up here.
One of these, I got a little obsessed with mine. In fact, I got a little obsessed with all my stuff. Have you ever wondered where all the stuff we buy comes from and where it goes when we throw it out? I couldn't stop wondering about that, so I looked it up. And what the textbook said is that stuff moves through a system from extraction to production to distribution to consumption to disposal. All together, it's called the materials economy. Well, I looked into it a little bit more. In fact, I spent 10 years traveling the world, tracking where our stuff comes from and where it goes. And you know what I found out? That is not the whole story. There is a lot missing from this explanation. For one thing, this system looks like it's fine. No problem. But the truth is, it's a system in crisis. And the reason it's a system in crisis is it's a linear system, and we live on a finite planet, and you cannot run a linear system on a finite planet indefinitely. Every step along the way, this system is interacting with the real world. In real life, it's not happening on a blank white page. It's interacting with societies, cultures, economies, the environment, and all along the way, it's bumping up against limits. Limits we don't see here because the diagram is incomplete. So let's go back through. Let's fill in some of the blanks and see what's missing. Well, one of the most important things that's missing is people. Yes, people. People live and work all along this system. And some people in this system matter a little more than others. Some have a little more say. Who are they? Well, let's start with the government. Now, my friends tell me I should use a tank to symbolize the government, and that's true in many countries and increasingly in our own. After all, more than 50% of our federal tax money is now going to the military. But I'm using a person to symbolize the government because I hold true to the vision and values the government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. It's the government's job to watch out for us, to take care of us. That's their job. Then along came the corporation. Now, the reason the corporation looks bigger than the government is that the corporation is bigger than the government. Of the 100 largest economies on Earth now, 51 are corporations. And as the corporation has grown in size and power, we've seen a little change in the government where they're a little more concerned in making sure everything's working out for those guys than for us. Okay, so let's see what else is missing from this picture. We'll start with extraction, which is a fancy word for natural resource exploitation, which is a fancy word for trashing the planet. What this looks like is we chop down the trees, we blow up mountains to get the metals inside, we use up all the water, and we wipe out the animals. So here we are running up against our first limit. We are running out of resources. We are using too much stuff. Now, I know this can be hard to hear, but it's the truth, so we've got to deal with it. In the past 3 decades alone, 1/3 of the planet's natural resource base has been consumed. Gone. We are cutting and mining and hauling and trashing the place so fast that we're undermining the planet's very ability for people to live here. Where I live, in the United States, we have less than 4% of our original forests left. 40% of the waterways have become undrinkable. And our problem is not just that we're using too much stuff, but we're using more than our share. We have 5% of the world's population, but we're using 30% of the world's resources and creating 30% of the world's waste. If everybody consumed at US rates, we would need 3 to 5 planets. And you know what? We've only got 1. So my country's response to this limitation is simply to go take somebody else's. This is the third world, which some would say is another word for our stuff that somehow got on somebody else's land. So what does that look like? The same thing, trashing the place. 75% of global fisheries now are fished at or beyond capacity. 80% of the planet's original forests are gone. In the Amazon alone, we're losing 2,000 trees a minute. That is 7 football fields a minute. And what about the people who live here? Well, according to these guys, they don't own these resources, even if they've been living there for generations. They don't own the means of production, and they're not buying a lot of stuff. And in this system, if you don't own or buy a lot of stuff, you don't have value. So next, the materials move to production. And what happens there is we use energy to mix toxic chemicals in with the natural resources to make toxic contaminated products. There are over 100,000 synthetic chemicals in use in commerce today. Only a handful of them have even been tested for health impacts, and none have been tested for synergistic health impacts. That means when they interact with all the other chemicals we're exposed to every day. So we don't know the full impact on health and the environment of all these toxic chemicals, but we do know one thing: toxics in, toxics out. As long as we keep putting toxics into our industrial production systems, we're going to keep getting toxics in the stuff that we bring into our homes and workplaces and schools. And our bodies. Like BFRs, brominated flame retardants, they're a chemical that make things more fireproof, but they are super toxic. They're a neurotoxin. That means toxic to the brain. What are we even doing using a chemical like this? Yet we put it in our computers, our appliances, couches, mattresses, even some pillows. In fact, we take our pillows, we douse them in a neurotoxin, then we bring them home and put our heads on them for 8 hours a night to sleep. Now, I don't know, but it seems to me in this country with so much potential, we could think of a better way to stop our heads from catching on fire at night. Now, these toxics build up the food chain and concentrate in our bodies. Do you know what is the food at the top of the food chain with the highest level of many toxic contaminants? Human breast milk. That means that we've reached a point where the smallest members of our societies, our babies, are getting the highest lifetime dose of toxic chemicals from breastfeeding from their mothers. Is that not an incredible violation? Breastfeeding must be the most fundamental human act of nurturing. It should be sacred and safe. Now, breastfeeding is still best, and mothers should definitely keep breastfeeding, but we should protect it. They should protect it. I thought they were looking out for us. And of course, the people who bear the biggest brunt of these toxic chemicals are the factory workers. many of whom are women of reproductive age. They're working with reproductive toxins, carcinogens, and more. Now I ask you, what kind of woman of reproductive age would work in a job exposed to reproductive toxins except for a woman with no other option? And that's one of the beauties of this system. The erosion of local environments and economies here ensures a constant supply of people with no other option. Globally, 200,000 people a day are moving from environments that have sustained them for generations into cities, many to live in slums, looking for work, no matter how toxic that work may be. So you see, it's not just resources that are wasted along this system, but people too. Whole communities get wasted. Yep, toxics in, toxics out. A lot of the toxics leave the factories in products, but even more leave as byproducts or pollution. And it's a lot of pollution. In the US, our industry admits to releasing over 4 billion pounds of toxic chemicals a year. And it's probably a lot more because that's only what they admit. So that's another limit, because yuck, who wants to look at and smell 4 billion pounds of toxic chemicals a year? So what do? Move the dirty factories overseas, pollute someone else's land. But surprise, a lot of that pollution is coming right back at us, carried by wind currents. So what happens after all these natural resources are turned into products? Well, it moves here for distribution. Now, distribution means selling all the toxic contaminated junk as quickly as possible. The goal here is to keep the prices down, keep the people buying, and keep the inventory moving. How do they keep the prices down? Well, they don't pay the store workers very much, and they skimp on health insurance every time they can. It's all about externalizing the costs. What that means is that the real costs of making stuff aren't captured in the price. In other words, we aren't paying for the stuff we buy. I was thinking about this the other day. I was walking to work and I wanted to listen to the news, so I popped into a Radio Shack to buy a radio. I found this cute little green radio for $4.99. I was standing there in line to buy this thing, and I was thinking, how could $4.99 possibly capture the cost of making this radio and getting it into my hands? The metal was probably mined in South Africa. The petroleum was probably drilled in Iraq. The plastics were probably produced in China. And maybe the whole thing was assembled by some 15-year-old in a maquiladora in Mexico. $4.99 wouldn't even pay the rent for the shelf space it occupied until I came along, let alone part of the staff guy's salary who helped me pick it out, or the multiple ocean cruises and truck rides pieces of this radio went on. That's how I realized I didn't pay for the radio. So who did pay? Well, these people paid with the loss of their natural resource space. These people paid with the loss of their clean air, with increasing asthma and cancer rates. Kids in the Congo paid with their future. 30% of the kids in part of the Congo have dropped out of school to mine coltan, a metal we need for our cheap and disposable electronics. These people even paid by having to cover their own health insurance. All along this system, people pitched in so I could get this radio for $4.99, and none of these contributions are recorded in any accounts book. That's what I mean by the company owners externalize the true costs of production. And that brings us to the golden arrow of consumption. This is the heart of the system, the engine that drives it. It is so important that protecting this arrow has become the top priority for both of these guys. That's why after 9/11, when our country was in shock, and President Bush could have suggested any number of appropriate things, to grieve, to pray, to hope. No, he said to shop, to shop. We have become a nation of consumers. Our primary identity has become that of being consumers, not mothers, teachers, farmers, but consumers. The primary way that our value is measured and demonstrated is by how much we contribute to this arrow, how much we consume. And do we? We shop and shop and shop, keep the materials flowing, and flow they do. Guess what percentage of total materials flow through this system is still in product or use 6 months after their date of sale in North America? 50%? 20? No, 1%. 1. In other words, 99% of the stuff we harvest, mine, process, transport, 99% of the stuff we run through this system is trashed within 6 months. Now, how can we run a planet with that level of materials throughput? It wasn't always like this. The average U.S. person now consumes twice as much as they did 50 years ago. Ask your grandma. In her day, stewardship and resourcefulness and thrift were valued. So how did this happen? Well, it didn't just happen. It was designed. Shortly after World War II, these guys were figuring out how to ramp up the economy. Retailing analyst Victor Lebow articulated the solution that's become the norm for the whole system. He said, our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate. President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors chairman said that the American economy's ultimate purpose is to produce more consumer goods. More consumer goods? Our ultimate purpose? Not provide health care or education or safe transportation or sustainability or justice? Consumer goods? How did they get us to jump on board this program so enthusiastically? Well, two of their most effective strategies are planned obsolescence and perceived obsolescence. Planned obsolescence is another word for designed for the dump. It means they actually make stuff to be useless as quickly as possible, so we'll chuck it and buy a new one. It's obvious with things like plastic bags and coffee cups, but now it's even big stuff. Mops, DVDs, cameras, barbecues even, everything. Even computers. Have you noticed that when you buy a computer now, the technology is changing so fast that in just a couple of years, it's actually an impediment to communication? I was curious about this, so I opened up a big desktop computer to see what was inside. And I found out that the piece that changes each year is just a tiny little piece in the corner. But you can't just change that one piece because each new version is a different shape. So you gotta chuck the whole thing and buy a new one. So I was reading industrial design journals from the 1950s when planned obsolescence was really catching on. These designers are so open about it. They actually discuss how fast can they make stuff break that still leaves the consumer having enough faith in the product to go out and buy another one. It was so intentional. But stuff cannot break fast enough to keep this arrow afloat. So there's also perceived obsolescence. Now, perceived obsolescence convinces us to throw away stuff that is still perfectly useful. How do they do that? Well, they change the way the stuff looks. So if you bought your stuff a couple of years ago, everyone can tell that you haven't contributed to this arrow recently. And since the way we demonstrate our value is contributing to this arrow, it can be embarrassing. Like, I've had the same fat white computer monitor on my desk for 5 years. My coworker just got a new computer. She has a flat, shiny, sleek monitor. It matches her computer, it matches her phone, even her pen stand. She looks like she's driving in Spaceship Central, and I look like I've got a washing machine on my desk. Fashion is another prime example of this. Have you ever wondered why women's shoe heels go from fat one year to skinny the next to fat to skinny? It's not because there's some debate about which heel structure is the most healthy for women's feet. It's because wearing fat heels in a skinny heel year shows everybody that you haven't contributed to that arrow as recently, so you're not as valuable as that person in skinny heels next to you, or more likely in some ad. It's to keep us buying new shoes. Advertisements and media in general plays a big role in this. Each of us in the U.S. is targeted with over 3,000 advertisements a day. We see more advertisements in 1 year than people 50 years ago saw in a lifetime. And if you think about it, what's the point of an ad except to make us unhappy with what we have? So 3,000 times a day, we're told our hair is wrong, our skin is wrong, our clothes are wrong, our furniture is wrong, our car is wrong, we are wrong, but it can all be made right if we just go shopping. Media also helps by hiding all of this and all of this. So the only part of the materials economy we see is the shopping. The extraction, production, and disposal all happens outside of our field of vision. So in the US, we have more stuff than ever before, but polls show that our national happiness is actually declining. Our national happiness peaked in the 1950s, the same time that this consumption mania exploded. Interesting coincidence. I think I know why. We have more stuff, but we have less time for the things that really make us happy. Friends, family, leisure time. We're working harder than ever. Some analysts say we have less leisure time than any time since feudal society. And do you know what the two main activities are that we do with the scant leisure time we have? Watch TV and shop. In the US, we spend 3 to 4 times as many hours shopping as our counterparts in Europe do. So we're in this ridiculous situation where we go to work, maybe 2 jobs even, and we come home and we're exhausted, so we plop down on our new couch and watch TV, and the commercials tell us you suck, so you gotta go to the mall to buy something to feel better, and then you gotta go to work more to pay for the stuff you just bought, so you come home and you're more tired, so you sit down and you watch more TV, and it tells you to go to the mall again, and we're on this crazy work, watch, spend treadmill, and we could just stop. So in the end, What happens to all the stuff we buy anyway? At this rate of consumption, it can't fit into our houses, even though the average house size has doubled in this country since the 1970s. It all goes out in the garbage. And that brings us to disposal. This is the part of the materials economy we all know the most because we have to haul the junk out to the curb ourselves. Each of us in the United States makes 4.5 pounds of garbage a day. That's twice what we each made 30 years ago. All of this garbage either gets dumped in a landfill, which is just a big hole in the ground, or if you're really unlucky, first it's burned in an incinerator and then dumped in the landfill. Either way, they both pollute the air, land, water, and don't forget, change the climate. Incineration is really bad. Remember those toxics back in the production stage? Well, burning the garbage releases the toxics up into the air. Even worse, it makes new super toxics, like dioxin. Dioxin is the most toxic man-made substance known to science, and incinerators are the #1 source of dioxin. That means that we could stop the #1 source of the most toxic man-made substance known just by stopping burning the trash. We could stop it today. Now, some companies don't want to deal with building landfills and incinerators here, so they just export the disposal too. What about recycling? Does recycling help? Yes, recycling helps. Recycling reduces the garbage at this end, and it reduces the pressure to mine and harvest new stuff at this end. Yes, 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 we should all recycle, but recycling is not enough. Recycling will never be enough, for a couple reasons. First, the waste coming out of our houses is just the tip of the iceberg. For every 1 garbage can of waste you put out on the curb, 70 garbage cans of waste were made upstream just to make the junk in that 1 garbage can you put out on the curb. So even if we could recycle 100% of the waste coming out of our households, it doesn't get to the core of the problems. Also, much of the garbage can't be recycled, either because it contains too many toxics or it's designed not to be recyclable in the first place. Like those juice packs, where they have layers of metal and paper and plastic all smushed together, you can never separate those for true recycling. So you see, it is a system in crisis. All along the way, we are bumping up against limits. From changing climate to declining happiness, it's just not working. But the good thing about such an all-pervasive problem is that there are so many points of intervention. There are people working here on saving forests and here on clean production, people working on labor rights and fair trade and conscious consuming and blocking landfills and incinerators, and very importantly, on taking back our government so that it really is by the people and for the people. All of this work is critically important, but things are really going to start moving when we see the connections, when we see the big picture. When people along this system get united, we can reclaim and transform this linear system into something new, a system that doesn't waste resources or people. Because what we really need to chuck is that old school throwaway mindset. There's a new school of thinking on this stuff, and it's based on sustainability and equity, green chemistry, zero waste, closed-loop production, renewable energy, local living economies. It's already happening. Now, some say it's unrealistic, idealistic that it can't happen, but I say the ones who are unrealistic are those that want to continue with the old path. That's dreaming. Remember, that old way didn't just happen. It's not like gravity that we've just got to live with. People created it, and we're people too. So let's create something new.
All right. So art doesn't purport to be an objective, nuanced, scientifically grounded account of reality. It lays out a perspective and asks you to respond to it. Whether you agree with it or not, it packs an awful lot of information into a very short, easily digested space. So what is art? The art that we're going to look at is fine art. Art is some sort of creative output. It could be come in many different forms. It affects our senses. Usually it's associated with some understanding of what's aesthetically pleasing. It communicates something to us, and it tells us something about the artist and about our world. In the field of art history, the field of art history is often contrasted to 2 other ways of grappling with art. Art criticism, which tells us, go to this exhibition, this is important, this is an exciting new thing. And art theory, which explores the philosophy behind concepts like beauty. Art history some of you may have read the book by Erwin Panofsky, or one of his many books. Erwin Panofsky was who? He was an art historian who left Germany just before World War II, went to become a professor at Princeton University, and was one of the very first people to work at the Institute for Advanced Study. And so he was working alongside Einstein back in the 1930s and 40s and so on. And he basically is considered one of the great architects of understanding art. He wrote about iconography. Iconography, not just how things look and how they were produced, but what they mean, what the images mean. And he organizes the field into people who study it using historical methods, their critics, and the connoisseurs. And historically, the field of art history was a very comfortable place for connoisseurs. In fact, up until probably the 1980s, connoisseurs dominated the field. Now, what do connoisseurs do? Why were connoisseurs so important in the field of art? Well, they're important for two reasons. First reason is they had a tremendous amount of authority in telling us what was valuable and what was not. So they said the peak of artistic achievement for humankind was the Renaissance, and especially the Italian Renaissance. And that those works that come from that period are the best works that you can find. And so they had an ability to say, this is an important period of art and this is a less important, which of course affects its value. They also had another capacity. They had the capacity to tell us whether a piece of art was authentic or not. So they would say, the Italian Renaissance is the most important period of art, and this sketch here is an authentic Leonardo, so it's worth an enormous amount of money. This one over here was probably done by one of his students. It is not an authentic piece. And to have that ability to say, this is an authentic Leonardo, this is a real Picasso, this is truly done by Raphael, and to say that's not, well, fortunes were made and lost on the basis of what connoisseurs told us about art. And they tended, because of where they came from, to privilege Western art. Now, they developed a very complex but sort of pretty schema of art over the ages, of art going back to, as far back as we can find art installations, and is organized through an ancient period, a classical period that focuses mainly on Greek and Roman art, a long medieval period, the Renaissance, which for many people is the highlight of art, into the modern and postmodern eras. And what I want to talk about for the next few minutes is one dimension of art. Because for most of history, art was considered to be a way of communicating something about people, or about religion, or about important events. And most of the art that we can look back upon had those as the subjects. And other things were considered to be not art. They were crafts, they were something else, but they were not fine art. Art had to do with these things, and it explained a great deal. It communicated a great deal. It said what was important. It said who was important. It said what events were important, and so on. And there's no doubt that when you look at this type of art like this, Michelangelo's creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel, you see clearly something that is, that has been produced by a true genius, somebody who understands form and color, who can produce something that very few people could ever aspire to. Probably nobody could ever aspire to something that powerful, that mastery of color, that mastery of subject, of the human form. Leonardo, for many people, this is the very peak of drawing. Nobody has been able to. Leonardo is instantly recognizable, although thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people have imitated his style. He developed a way of translating the real world into two dimensions that was unique, pioneering, and path-breaking. There's no doubt he was an artistic genius. The value of art, you may be familiar with people like Lorenzo Lotto, and here's Lorenzo Lotto. And Lorenzo Lotto, a Venetian painter famous for his altarpieces and so on throughout Italy and so on, a much sought after altarpiece painter. And who paid him to produce altarpieces? Well, it wasn't poor people, it was the rich people. Rich people paid him to produce altarpieces. And so here's a picture of the Madonna and the Child with two patrons. And you can see the sumptuous clothes of the Madonna. And the patrons, who actually are the richest people in the community, are dressed in very humble colors. They have these expressions of piety. It looks like Christ is blessing them, you know, and they look up at him. And that's what this communicates, because this would be an altarpiece in the one place where everybody would see day after day. It tells you a great deal of who's important. And it tells you a great deal about the qualities of these people. These are people who Christ has blessed himself. These are people allowed in the presence of Christ and the Madonna. And you can see landscape in these types of paintings, and this is typical of the entire period. Landscape is something in the background, just there's not the focal point by any means. If you look at another famous Lotto, here's a rendering of the famous, and nobody knows whether this really happened, but the mystic marriage of Saint Catherine. Who was Saint Catherine? Anybody? So you really ought to take a course in art history. Saint Catherine was reputed to be a very beautiful woman who was also incredibly intelligent. And as a very young child, she converted to Christianity at a time when the Romans were persecuting Christians. And she was the daughter of the king and queen of Alexandria. And so this was a problem. Here was the daughter of the king and queen of Alexandria embracing a religion that was out of favor with the authorities. And so she was invited by the emperor to come and defend her position. And so he invited all the intellectuals that he could find, and he brought them together with her to dispute her belief in Christianity. And the story goes, they were not able to develop arguments which disproved her own positions. So the emperor said to her, you have a choice. You can recant, or I'll give you one other choice, because you're attractive, you can marry me. And she said, no, I'm married to Christ. So he put her on what is now known as the Catherine wheel. The Catherine wheel was a wheel where they attached a person's arms and legs, and as it spun around, they broke the bones in their limbs. And so it was a sort of slow and unpleasant death. Now, this painting, of course, here you have Catherine. Christ is actually touching her. She's wearing sumptuous clothing, as befits a member of the royal family. There's an angel behind her. The Madonna is dressed well. But who's in the background? At the same level of all these incredibly important and spiritual figures? Well, the donor, the patron. He has asked the artist to put himself in there. And there he is on the same level as Christ and the Madonna. And guess what? Not only he's dressed humbly, but he's on the same level with them. He's part of the show. He's part of the scene. And Lotto has cleverly taken some of his possessions, because he's dressed them very poorly, but he showed the sumptuous carpets that he has owned, and he's turned them over so you can see that you can get a little glimpse that this guy's actually very rich. So he's taken that carpet in the left-hand corner and turned it over. The detail's not good here. But the cue is, this guy is the paradigm of piety. He interacts at this level. He's an important guy. He is the most important person in our city. And he's also rich. These things tell a huge and important story. Now, of course, we don't know whether St. Catherine really lived. But whether we look there, whether we go back further in time, we see that landscape, that the environment, that the natural environment is almost never represented. And when it is represented, it's represented in a very, very small way, until the Dutch painters do something dramatic. And in the 16th century, and have any of you been to the beach at Scheveningen? Do you know where it is? So if you have you ever taken the ferry from from Hull in the UK to the Netherlands? There's an overnight ferry that goes across. You never done that? It's a party. You have to do it once in your lives. When you get off the ferry, you get off just below this beach. This beach is part of The Hague. It's one of the 8 districts of The Hague. It's a very important place because, of course, it's The Hague. The Hague is the site of the ICC. The ICC is the International criminal court and so on. But here we have an artist who's basically bucking centuries of tradition. And for the first time, we start to see that people are not the focus, but it is the sky and the water and the land. And the great powerful academies of, and the most powerful academies in Europe were the academies of France and the academies of Italy, said, this is nice, but it is not art. It is not art. He has a clever hand, but it is not art. That's not a worthy subject of the artist. Well, it took a long time before that view changed, and people like Claude Lorraine and Nicolas Poussin began to follow the Dutch and produce paintings in which more and more you were drawn to the landscape and not the figures. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Paramus and Thisbe, but just in case one or two of you are not, I'll refresh your memory. Everybody knows the story. Well, here we have, and here what he's doing is he's saying this landscape helps us understand the story. It tells us part of that story. Paramus and Thisbe were raised in two wealthy patriarchal families in Babylon, and their houses were joined. But the parents of the two children hated each other and would not allow the children to ever meet. Well, the children found that they had a way of communicating through the wall of the shared wall of their two houses. And as teenagers, they fell in love. But they had never seen each other, and their parents would not allow them to see each other. So they concocted a plan that they would go outside and they would meet. They would meet each other for the first time ever. They would lay eyes on each other for the first time ever, out in the fields far away from their house. And here are these two teenagers go out in the middle of the night, and Thisbe arrives first. And when she gets to the scene, there's a lion feeding. And she decides to retreat into the shadows. And when she retreats, she drops the veil that she was wearing, which she had advised Pyramus she would be wearing so that he could identify her. She drops it. And she goes into the shadows. And Pyramus gets there, and he sees the lion eating, and he sees the veil, and he thinks he's eating Thisbe. And so he falls on his sword. He makes a great grand gesture and kills himself. A couple of minutes later, Thisbe comes out looking for this guy. The lion's gone, but here's just this dead body. And she realizes it's Pyramus. So she grabs the sword and kills herself. So it's not a really happy story. It's not a really super happy story, although, many relationships, anyways. In the 18th century, the great academies, for the first time say, you can paint a landscape and we will call it art. And with that license, people suddenly do something they have never done before. They take their paints out into the world to explore it. Here are the cliffs at Étretat. Do you know where Étretat is? I'll tell you anyways, just in case you don't. Étretat is in the north of France. And it's a very famous resort area, famous for its huge stone arches, natural stone arches. And this is a Monet. Monet goes out there and he paints them. And Monet starts to introduce what we call Impressionism. Not these finely detailed things, not art in the background, but but landscapes in your face, the impression of the beauty of nature. And this is in partly a response to industrialization, the way cities are becoming grayer and bleaker and so on. And he goes out with these bright, bright palettes, and he paints these things, and they're powerful. And the taste of the entire Europe starts to shift towards an adoration of the landscape. It doesn't mean that portraits and religious figures and events and historical events are not still important, but landscapes become tremendously prized, and they evolve over time. This is about the same time photography comes into its own, and we have photographers who do nothing but landscapes. I'm sure you've seen Ansel Adams, who made, where was Ansel Adams from? Northern California, right. So he's from San Francisco. He's a Bay Area kid who died, 20, 30 years ago. And he falls in love with one part of California and makes it famous to everybody on the planet, Yosemite. So his photographs of Yosemite become world famous. And he does nothing but look at landscapes. Nothing. And he travels around a little bit. He does a few landscapes in Colorado and Montana and Arizona. But his great love is the natural beauty of California. And it touches many, many people. And many people start to follow and emulate him. And so all of a sudden, from being something in the background or something not even acknowledged, but something certainly considered not worthy of artistic creativity, landscapes move into the forefront and become an expression of what we believe to be beautiful and important, and so on. And of course, this feeds very nicely into the turbulence of the 1960s that we've already covered. And the first thing so in the 1960s, and you may have read books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring or Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, which are about, destruction of the environment and our tendency towards a consumer culture and so on. And so artists suddenly in the 60s say, we're not going to be commodified. Art will not be a commodity. Not everybody says that. Andy Warhol's saying the exact opposite. Andy Warhol says, commodities are art themselves. But many other people say we're going to produce big, massive things that can't be sold or moved, that nobody can ever own. Or transitory things. Famously, things like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which is in a lake in Utah. Now, while it focuses on the importance of dematerializing art as refusing to commodify art, it's not particularly environmentally sensitive. So this spiral that he creates, 1,500 feet long, 15 feet wide, of stone and earth, has been very controversial. On the one hand, nobody's ever going to buy that and own it. It's out there, and it's for everybody, and he put a lot of effort into it, and he's not going to make money. Well, actually, he probably did make a lot of money on it in the end. I think he did a documentary film of himself and a whole bunch of others. But now, some people have complained that it also damaged the environment to a certain degree. And so you had these people sort of, on the one hand, protesting consumer culture and trying to get back more close to nature and use raw materials and create big pieces of art and create art that was going to be up for a short period of time and then be taken down and that could never be owned, could never end up hanging in somebody's house. But because this wasn't always sensitive to the damage it was doing, another movement sprung up almost coterminous with this, and there's no real name for it. People call it sustainable art or sustainability art or art and sustainability or whatever you want to call it. But it's art that respects the very principles, that is informed by the principles that we have been talking about in this class for the past 9 weeks. So we have an entire, so one of the most creative wings of our society are artists who are grappling with what does sustainability mean. And they have done some truly remarkable things as they explore the relationship between art and natural environment, as they ask about the role of their artist. And here are some of the, this is the, this is a piece made of what? Ice. So the artist has simply collected ice and put it together, knowing that it takes him all night long to produce this, but within a couple of hours of the sun coming up, it will melt away. And his focus is to produce beauty using just what's available in nature and understanding that it will return to nature without having done any harm to it. He doesn't require anything else but nature itself. Here's a rock, and he has collected, it's autumn, and he's collected thousands and thousands of yellow leaves, and then he's used water to attach them to a rock. And he knows that there's a sequence of photographs, and it looks like this, and then the leaves start to dry, and they start to fall off, and eventually you see the rock. The rock is restored. But beautiful, beautiful pieces of art. And if you, if you're not familiar with the work, this guy's name is Andy Goldsworthy. He's probably the most famous sustainable artist on the planet, a British guy. In fact, maybe we can listen to him for one quick second. I think I have him talking about. Here's Japanese maple leaves that he has intricately stitched together using nothing but what he found to create this pattern in a tidal pool, a pattern which obviously can only endure for a very short time because these things are just held into place. A trail of dandelions through a field. And this beautiful piece of ice, which he nurtured around a tree. And here, let's just listen to him tell us a little bit about what he's trying to do.
Art for me is a form of nourishment. I need the land. I need it. I want to understand that state and that energy that I have in me that I also feel in the plants and in the land. is running through, flowing through the landscape.
Now, one of the things about Andy Goldsworthy is, and it's not easy necessarily to tell from that short clip, is that all the materials he's using are local materials which return back to their original form. So the red is just the earth that naturally flows into the stream. Many of the patterns are patterns that he has worked out on sheets of ice, natural ice, or snowfields. The walls are earthworks, which after the installation get flattened back down into the earth, and so on. So they're huge works of labor. They don't endure, but they are, at least in the eyes of many people, remarkably beautiful. And he's not the only person. I think it gives us some hope that we have seen nature move from the background of art and creativity into the foreground as a subject in its own right, to now becoming the materials for a much deeper engagement with thinking through things. And it isn't just trying to find ways to take what is out there so that you don't have to go to a store and buy all your stuff to produce a piece of art, nor do you have to create 70 bags of trash to produce a single artwork. But many other artists following this tradition look at telling us other types of stories about what is happening. Now here's Sonja Henriksen, of course. This is a beautiful piece. She had a group of people, a group of her students, in a snowfield in Steamboat, Colorado, and it took them apparently about 3 hours to produce this pattern, just following her instructions. And yes, by the end of the day, it was gone again, but remarkable somehow. Somehow it's moving, and somehow it's powerful, and it tells us something about. And then there are other people who use waste to produce art. Shane McAdams, for example, famously takes ballpoint pens that are about to be discarded, heats them up, and then blows the last bits of ink out to create these beautiful designs. This being one of them. He calls them pen blow art. Sean Avery, who works with discarded CDs. And here, typical of his work, here's a sculpture just using bits and pieces of a CD to put it together. And he takes something that would otherwise, just collect in trash, and shows that you can produce something remarkable out of it, something that people would be proud to have hang in their house. Chris Jordan, possibly our best known artist in this tradition, and he lives up in Washington State. Here, each one of these is a storage container, and he points out that every 12 hours, 38,000 containers of stuff arrive in our ports, and other stuff, of course, is arriving in different ways, but 38,000 containers of stuff. These containers are so big that there are NGOs now that convert them into housing and into, you can go online, there's an interesting NGO that takes a container, adds water and energy into it, and medical supplies, and makes mini field hospitals, mini clinics, and wherever you can deliver a container, and guess what? You can deliver a container anywhere on the planet. Anywhere you can deliver a container, you can now deliver a hospital, or a school, or something. And that's pretty creative use of what otherwise just sort of wear out, get a little bit spongy, and get turned into massive landfills. Here Chris Jordan takes on, you know, a sort of obsession with form, and makes it out of, that is made out of Barbie dolls. And of course he's telling us something about the massive number of Barbie dolls that have created a perception of things like beauty, and he turns them around and uses them a different way. That's a heck of a lot of Barbie dolls. This Rothko type, that's a lot of Barbie dolls. This Rothko type painting this Rothko type image, it's not a painting, it's a photograph, is produced out of 2.3 million what? Prison uniforms. And what he's done is, it's a prison uniform for every prisoner, every person who was incarcerated at the time that he produced this, which I think was 2005. And so he said, here's what 2.3 million uniforms, and he calls it prisoners as waste. How are we doing on time? Chris Jordan also goes on the beach. This is a great thing I do with my own kids. We go on the beach and we produce pieces of art just with what the materials that we find there. And he produces these things. These ones are not also all that happy, but they're somehow compelling. And of course, Tony Adams and so on. So what you have is a group of artists who are sort of in some ways a tremendous source of creativity for our country, for the world. And I think that they're the ones who often lead in forcing us to think of things anew, thinking of things in new ways, valorizing things that had no value before they brought human creativity to them. Things that, bottles, they had no value, they'd just be dumped out until an artist says, no, I can bring my imagination and creativity to this, and I can produce something beautiful. And if we fail this century, if we fail, then I think that it will be a failure of imagination, a failure to take the great stock of creativity that we have, that is the gift of our species, and finding ways to harness it to the challenges that we face. It will not be a failure of government. It will not be a failure of corporations. It'll be a failure of our own imagination. And there's no need for it. We can take the example of these people who are showing us that there's different ways to create beauty. There's different ways to create meaning. There's different ways to bring people together. There's different ways to touch people. And they can be less harmful, less damaging, less permanent, less destined for, as they show in that first little film clip, less destined for obsolescence. Art used to be called, people used to say, well, art is the one thing that never can be recycled. It can never be recycled because a work of art you want to keep forever. You're not going to trash it. But these artists are challenging that, and they're saying, like the Buddhist monks who produce sand mandalas, which at the end of an intricate process of dropping grains of colored sand onto an enormous board and producing an intricate image from memory. At the end of it, what do? And if you haven't spent 2 weeks watching a sand mandala being constructed, then again, your life is somehow less than it should be. At the end of it, they sweep it into a pile, and they return that sand back to the earth. They don't keep it. They don't say, okay guys, have we got some aerosol that we can spray all over this so that we can keep it forever? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, there isn't some art we should keep forever. Of course there is. There are some things that we'll always need. But we can take an example from how we can look at things anew, change how we understand things, use things in new ways. And when we do that, when we ask ourselves to be creative, if you haven't seen Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk about creativity, you should definitely watch that. Because I think that the crisis in imagination is because our potential for creativity is so often being sucked away from us early in life as we're forced to do things like maximize the results of standardized tests, which, let's just say in the grand scheme of things, do not get any civilization very far. And I don't think that Athens or Babylon or Alexandria or any other country that has produced great works, or city that has produced great works, did it on the platform of standardized testing. In fact, we know for sure that none of them did. But But not only do we have complete and utter faith in it, we've developed an entire cottage industry around it, an industry which produces absolutely no value of any kind. And yet there's so much value to be produced out there if we set our minds to it. So these artists, they're not the whole story, of course. That's the whole point of this course. We need to listen to engineers, and we need to listen to scientists. We need to listen to moral philosophers. We need to listen to historians and economists and political scientists. We need to listen to everybody. But these artists tell us something important. They tell us something in a way that nobody else can tell it to us. And one of the great things is they invite, because every single person in this room has the capacity to be creative, has the capacity to produce art, to make their life into some sort of work of art itself. Everybody has that creativity. Nobody is born without any creativity. And so these artists invite us to do precisely this. Now, visual arts is what I focused on because I have a particular liking of visual arts, but the Earth studio that we have in the research center I direct is actually a performance studio. And the concept of sustainability has not been, grappling with it has not been simply the remit of visual arts. Performing artists have also told us a great deal. And so what I would like you to do now, because for the next part of the lecture we will need to go outside. So if you will get up, take your valuables, I guess, or there are thieves who are going to be here. I don't know if anybody's going to remain in the room. We will go outside for a performance on art and sustainability that has been set up outside. And then at the end of the performance, I would ask you all to return here right away. Now, just before anybody leaves, the scaffolding is set up in the, just outside here to the right, up towards the street. You can't miss it, just before the stairs. There are cameras, and there's an audio system and a large scaffolding. I would really like it if you would form a neat U on the outside perimeter of this, because to press in will actually put the artist at some danger. So if you could just follow us and nicely create a large U. This is also going to be photographed, but you won't be recognized, so there is no need for releases. And immediately following the performance, I'd invite you all to come back here for the final bit of today's lecture. Thank you very much. Just follow us outside, please.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world. Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die. And the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. World that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let